get through this.
He's a Philistine. I was able to do it. He's on the dancing. I'm not a great lover of cats. That's my fear.
You're a disgrace, you are.
Not me. That's my fear.
You're a disgrace, you are.
Hello and welcome to One-on-One Shadowboxing. Have your say. Today our guest in the WTV studios is Phil Scott from Rise Up Australia. Hi Phil.
Pleased to meet you, Tibor, and thanks for the invitation today.
You're welcome. Rise Up Australia, it sounds like a battle cry.
Well, it is, I suppose. It's a party that wants the people of Australia to be heard. Quite often the politicians we've had have put the party first rather than the interests of the people.
That's all everywhere in the world, unfortunately. But we don't want to have that, of course.
No, but what we want is politicians who will represent the constituencies as was originally intended. We don't want the pursuit of power to undermine the long-term vision for Australia. Now, I personally think that having a 3-year term for the federal government is too short. By the time the government's settled, they're looking at the polls already. And how can we get power again? I would much prefer that we had a 5-year term, a fixed term for federal parliament.
And that will change what? The attitude of the
It gives-
politicians
it
or
gives-
the
well,
behaviour of the electorate?
Hopefully it gives more time for them to implement the policies they have without looking over their shoulder to the next election. I think Australians are looking for politicians who
Yes.
will walk the walk and talk the talk. Now, Rise Up Australia Party isn't composed of politicians. It's just ordinary people like myself, working people, who are tired of seeing our parliament brought into disrepute.
But we're not bringing them into disrepute, are we?
No, I think they bring themselves into disrepute when they behave like children in the schoolyard during parliament time.
And you think if we got giving them 5 years, they're changing their behavior? Because all through the 3 years, they're behaving the same way. They, as you said on television, if you watch them, you just see kids in the kindergarten, or worse. I not disagree with you on changes needed, because I got the same feeling myself. So that's the feeling of everyone, I think, in Australia. The big question is, have we got the chance to decide who is replaced who? Because we mainly got 2 major parties. So the time I couldn't understand myself, you can explain, how does it change it? So how does it provide more access to other alternative political parties get into the parliament?
I think it provides more stability because if you have a policy that's going to take time to come into fruition, then 5 years is a longer time to see that happening.
I agree. But if you just remember of the previous election, they went into promises, not policies, and they gone out without any policy, with lots of promises again. So I understand the wish of the people. They would like to see stability, and even the parties maybe want to see more stable sort of term. But when they're walking in with no policy, with promises which they've broken, or with lies they do deliberately, the time is, for me, couldn't fix anything. But that's from that, so that's just my comment, and you try to convince me, and I don't think the audience being convinced the time gives more, because these parties just not forming the policy.
Well,
the stability in
I
time,
can't change
yes.
people's behaviour if they want to renege on their promises. I mean, Tony Abbott, a classic example, he made cast iron promises, and now we've seen him go back on his word. It's like the old joke, you know, when a politician's lips are moving, you know he's lying. So, you know, people are tired of that. Rise Up Australia Party is a party we're organised as a corporation, so we're bound by our policies. That makes us different to some of the other parties that are standing.
Okay, then let's go to the policies. But before that, something about you. What's your background?
I immigrated here 26 years ago from the UK, as you can probably tell. It's hard to
From the accent, yes.
lose your accent.
Like me, I couldn't change my accent much. Yes. So, Phil, what's...
I currently work as a courier, so I know the difficulties faced by working people, particularly in Perth, which has become a very difficult place to survive financially.
So how do you choose politics, or why?
I think I've always been interested in it, and I've always been interested in history, how different states and nations have evolved over time, and what makes one nation more successful than another nation. And I believe that politicians are there to serve the people as servants, not for their party. And it's all very well to sit with a snag on the barbie and say, oh, isn't it terrible what the politicians are doing? But unless you're willing to get your hands dirty and make changes, then
you have to be a
the same.
politician if you want to have your hands dirty.
Or at least lobby the politicians, do something, you know?
So who is and how old is this party, Raise Up Australia? Sounds like a revolution.
It sounds like a revolution, but we're a peaceful revolution. It
So
started 2 years ago.
2 years ago, yes.
The founder, Danny Nalaya, is a gentleman from Sri Lanka who came here 11 years ago, and he won a very important court case centred on freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is basic to Australian democracy.
That's what we think, and that's what we hope, yes. So let's go into some of the policies, if
Sure.
you don't mind, Phil.
No.
First of all, you are listing as number 1 or A, not B, that Parliament is need reform, and the Parliament have to go back to the Constitution and the constitutional written words. So tell the audience, what's wrong with our Parliament?
I think, as I alluded to earlier, there's too much maintaining power at all costs. They're not listening to the people. They're listening to people behind the scenes, whether it's big corporations or unions, and this applies to both parties. We want politicians who will listen to the cry of the people on the street, the farmer who's struggling to sell his produce, the homeless person who can't find anywhere to live. We don't want party before people. We want real politicians who will stand up for the areas they represent.
Unfortunately, there's no schools for politicians. So probably the people who elect politicians have to teach them a lesson how to represent them.
I think many politicians have gone straight into politics from university or privileged backgrounds.
They are career politicians.
Career politicians, and Rise Up Australia Party is anything but career politicians. I'm astonished by the different backgrounds of people who put their name up to represent us around the nation in September. The media were astounded that we had candidates in nearly every constituency. They couldn't work it out. And it was because people were concerned about the roads Australia was taking. We've become a more uneven society. The sense of a fair go, a fair shake of the sauce bottle, as Kevin Rudd said, is going out the window. There's a bigger disparity between rich and poor than when I came here 26 years ago, and it's got worse.
In the 21st century, in 2014, you're talking about, and your party policy talking about full employment, and employment with real wages.
Well, that's right. I mean,
so how is it coming in? Everyone around the world in the Western democracies struggling with employment. Look at Europe. How many countries got 30%? Or with young employment, 50% unemployment. And Britain is not really good in this one either. So where is that come from, and how can Australia do that, to have full employment?
Well, that's a big question. It's a good question, and it's one that's the core of problems that face Australia today. You know, the governments here and overseas, they massage the employment figures. If someone's got a casual job, they're in work, and that they can be out of work next week. Australia is a nation that is blessed above all other nations in the world with resources, with farmland, and so on. Now, if we continue down the path we're going. We've had Tony Abbott selling farmland off in the north of our state to overseas interests. Okay, you need investment, but at the very least have a lease back. We owe it to our children and children's children that they have control over their land, that they have food security, and that they have a manufacturing industry so that they're employed.
So why don't politicians understand that little simple lesson?
I think they're tied to ideologies. They're afraid to be flexible. They're afraid to admit they're wrong sometimes. I hope that in the future there'll be cross-party preference in the Senate. There won't be just one party, that people with good ideas will come together and say we want to take this country forward and look after our children and children's children.
So why the politicians then understand the needs of the banks and not the agriculture, not the manufacturing? And they're happy to jump and help the banks out.
That's a good question, isn't it? I mean, I think that there's a case for regulating the banks, for making sure they give low interest loans to Australian industries, Australian farmers, and we need to instigate programs that will help Australian producers. We need to retain 51% of infrastructure in this country, of any major industry. We need to have utilities like electricity, gas and water in government hands and not for profit, because these are the things that everyday life depends on.
On that note, Phil, we have to go for a short break. Stay with us, because after the break we're coming back with more discussion with Phil from the Rise of Australia Party.